Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Avodah Zarah Daf Chav Gimel, Avodah Zarah 23. Today's Daf Yomi is dedicated for Shmir for the Chayalim, Hatzal for the Shvuyim, and Yeshua for Am Yisrael. The Gemara is discussing a contradiction between the Mishnah and the Tosefta. The Mishnah says you're not allowed to leave your animals with the idolaters because the assumption is that they will sodomize your animals, and then you'll be violating prohibition of causing somebody else to sin, lifnei yiver, because an idolater is also not allowed to be with an animal. But the Tosefta says that you can purchase an animal from an idolater, and we don't have to be concerned. You can purchase it for a sacrifice. We don't have to be concerned that the animal is sodomized. So that shows we're not concerned about the idolaters sleeping with the animals. So the first answer that the Gemara gave is it depends whose animal it is. As it relates to our animals, that we are concerned that they'll sodomize it because they have this desire. But as it relates to their animals, we're not concerned that they're going to sodomize their animals because that's going to ruin their animals. That's the first answer the Gemara gives to this contradiction between the Mishnah and the Tosefta. Gemara is going to give several more answers on today's daf. Ravina on the top of Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, Ravina says, "Lo kasha." Ravina says it's not a problem. Halachatchila hadiavad. That and what it doesn't mean what lechatchila and b'diavad means throughout Shas. Lechatchila means, in this case, initially speaking, you can't give your animal to the idolater to watch because there's a concern that they're going to sleep with their animal. But diavad, in a situation where the animal was raised by the idolater, then we're allowed to purchase it from them because we're not concerned. We don't have to be concerned that they sodomize the animal under those circumstances. That we don't have to be concerned about. And so that's what it means here, lechatchila and b'diavad, meaning lechatchila, you can never give it to them. But in the case where it was raised already by the animal, then we can assume it's okay. But you can't give it to them initially. And so the Tosefta is talking about a case where b'diavad and lechatchila is where we can't do it. Gemara says, Umana temra deshani ben lechatchila b'diavad. And the Gemara says, I'll prove to you that there is this distinction between whether you can give something to them or whether they've already raised it. How do we know such a distinction exists? The Tanam, because we have our Mishnah. Our Mishnah itself states that a woman was not allowed to be secluded with the idolaters because of the concern that she would sleep with them, and so therefore she's never allowed to be secluded with the idolaters. But we have a contradiction to this. We learn in Ksuvos, Ha'isha shenechbasha b'deo v'kochavim, if there is a woman who was Rahman al captured, and anytime we talk about captured, we have to remember and pray for the hostages who are still being held in captivity since October 7th. They should be foremost in our prayers. When we say a woman who was captured by the idolaters, Aydei Mamon, if she was captured because Rashi says, the husband owes the idolater money. He's trying to raise money from her. So then mutaras labala. Then we assume that she's allowed to go back to her husband because, but ayidei nefashos. But if he captures her because she's going to be killed, then she's not allowed to return to her husband. So we see from here that in a case where it is lechatchila, so we see from here that the first source says that a woman is that she's not allowed to be secluded because we suspect about arayos. But in the Mishnah and Ksubos, we say that a woman who is captured, or in the Gemara and Ksubos, we say that a woman was captured, she's allowed to return to her husband if it was for money. We mean to say that they're not suspected about arayos. And how do we explain the distinction? No, so we have to draw a distinction between a case with lechatchila, she's not allowed to do it, but b'diavad, if it was done, if she was secluded and it was only for money, then we're going to assume it's okay and she can go back to her husband. So So the Gemara says, no, that's not the case. Mimai, how do we know that that's a distinction? Really, I could say to you that even in the case after the fact, that even after the fact, she can't go back to her husband. What's the reason that in this case she's allowed to return to her husband? In the case of money, she's the reason why the husband would ransom her. And so now the idolater is worried that if he's going to assault her, or if he's going to be with her, he's going to lose his money. So that's the reason. And that's actually the same reason why. So that's the reason why she would be allowed to go back. But in general, we're not going to draw this distinction between Lechatchila and B'diavad. And Teda, I'll prove it to you, the Ketani Sefer, because the next clause of the source there says, Ayadei Nefashos Asur Abala, that it says, it says there, Ayadei Nefashos, if it was a case of a capital crime, meaning to say where she was going to be executed, Asur Abala, she'd be prohibited to return to her husband. The Suwa Midi, and you can't challenge us anymore. For sure, if it's for money, it's permitted because he doesn't want to lose his money. So therefore, we can't prove like Ravina that this distinction. What kind of Jew are we talking about here? There's two possibilities. Is a Jew who's a Kohen or a Jew who's in Israel. If he's a Kohen, then even if she was assaulted against her will, she's not allowed to return to her husband. If he's a Yisrael, then only if she was willingly involved in the relations with the idolater is she prohibited to go back to her husband. Here it's a case where it's willing, but it's under duress, meaning to say the direct action was not forced, but the situation was a situation that created an environment where she desired to be with the man in order to somehow gain her freedom. So Rashi says, Rashi agrees that there's two possibilities. Rashi says that even though others say that we're talking about a Kohen, he thinks that the first approach is the main approach, i.e., that her husband is Yisrael, and the concern is that she would willingly be with this man in order to either find favor with him, or because if she's secluded with him, she'll fall in love with him. Anyway, the Gemara does not accept Ravina's answer; it can't prove it. So we're still trying to. We're in the middle of 23a. Gemara is still trying to figure out why there's a contradiction between the Mishnah and the Tosefta, with the Mishnah saying you can't give your animal to the idolaters, and the Tosefta saying you can buy a sacrifice from the idolaters, and you're not concerned that the animal was sodomized. So Rabbi Pedas gives a third answer now. He says, Lo kasha, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbanan. It's a machokas Tanaim. That the two sources reflect different opinions amongst the Tanaim. The Tanan, because we learned by the Paras Chatas. Paras Chatas is another way, Rashi says, of talking about the red heifer, because the Torah calls it the Mechatos, and so therefore it's the Paras Chatas is the red heifer. And Eliezer says, Eino nichais mina ovdei kochavim. You're not allowed to purchase it from an idolater. It doesn't say why, but it says in the Mishnah and Paro that you're not allowed to purchase the red heifer from the idolater. And the Chachamim allow it. So the Gemara says, let's say, everybody okay?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. What about the famous case that they wanted to buy a...
Baruch Hashem, that's going to be exactly, my father is correct, that's going to be exactly, the Gemara is going to bring up that story at the very, very end of our daf, and really on the daf for Shabbos. So, as my grandmother used to say, I'm manit. We'll get there, Baruch Hashem. Okay, so the Mishnah in Parah says, Rabbi Eliezer says, "Eino niches mina ovdei kochavim v'chamim matirim." He says you can't buy the paraduma from the idolaters, and the chamim allow it. What are they arguing about? Isn't there argument to Rabbi Eliezer savar chashina ravia? Rabbi Eliezer must be like our Mishnah, that we have to be concerned that the animal was sodomized, and therefore you can't buy it for the paraduma. Rabbanan savri lo chashina ravia, whereas the Rabbanan hold like the Tosefta here and say we're not concerned that the animal slept with the paraduma, and therefore you can purchase it. So isn't that the distinction that our Mishnah is like Rebbe Eliezer and the Tosefta is like the Rabbanan are like the Tosefta? Gemara says, no. Maybe even Rebbe Eliezer is not concerned about Ravia. So what's the reason why Rebbe Eliezer says you can't purchase the red heifer? Because he holds like because his position is consistent with the statement that Rav Yehuda Marav. Rav Yehuda Marav, he niachalei an oda shel sakin tasla. So the red heifer can be disqualified even if you put anything on it, even uda shalsakin, even like a bunch of bags, basically empty bags tied together, and you put on the red heifer, that would disqualify it because it can't even have a yoke on it. If you see like the red heifers that are being raised today in Shiloh, they're under very tight security because if somebody would just put a bag on it, that would disqualify it. So therefore, how are you going to buy a red heifer from an idolater? Who knows about the hashkacha that it was on it? It wouldn't have any hashkacha, and so therefore, it has nothing to do with sex with the red heifer. It has to do with the fact that it can't have a bag on it. So and egla rufa, there it's a little bit stricter. There's a little bit more lenient until it actually pulls a burden. Then it would disqualify the calf that was set aside for the egla rufa. But anyway, we see from here that that's a distinction. And there Eliezer says we have to be concerned about the Uda Shal Sakin, that it had a bags on it. Umar Savar Lo Chashina, whereas Rabbanan are not concerned. The Gemara says, no, let's not say that. Lo Salka Daitoch. It's not possible to assume that that's the distinction. You can't assume Misham Nicha Porta Lo Mafsatuva. The idolater knows what's at stake. He knows that if he puts a little bundle on the red heifer, he's going to lose his, as he say, his cash cow. That's his cash cow. Bar Aduma is worth a lot of money. So to get a little bit of help with his bag, he's not going to lose a lot of money. We don't have to be concerned about that. Mara says, well, if that's the case, why are we concerned about intercourse with the animal? Why don't we say we don't have to be concerned about the animal sleeping with the idolater because he's not going to lose his whole value of the red heifer just to have a little bit of fleeting pleasure from his act with the cow. The Gemara says, no, that we do have to be concerned about. Why? Because there's the possibility when it comes to the Yetzer for Arayos, that is Yetzer Hara will be so strong it'll overwhelm him and he'll have intercourse with the animal, even though he knows he's going to lose a lot of money. Gemara says, V'dilma, but there's another possibility. Maybe Koyamo Chashino Ravia. Maybe the Rabbanan are also not worried about Ravia. Maybe the Rabbanan, maybe Rebbe, not only the Rabbanan, but also Rebbe Eliezer is not worried about intercourse with the animal. So what's the reason why Rebbe Eliezer says you cannot purchase a para aduma from the idolaters? For a different reason. Can the Tani Shila, my time with the Rebbe Eliezer? Oh, what's the reason for Rebbe Eliezer says you can't buy? Because it says, Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yichlu elecha. So it says in the pasuk, speak to the children of Israel, v'yichlu elecha para aduma. And Rashi says, Karibe via kichu, meaning to say you're not allowed to purchase from the idolaters this red heifer. B'nei Yisrael yichu ve'ena the kuchavim yichu. That you should take it from the Israelites and not from the idolaters. So it's a specific reason by the red heifer that you're not allowed to purchase it from the idolater. Maybe that's the reason. It's nothing to do with Ravia. Gemara says, no, don't say that to Katani Seifa, because the next clause of that price states, Rabbi Eliezer said you can't buy any sacrifices from the idolaters. And if you want to say it's like Sheila said, it makes sense to say that by a red heifer, it says kicha, and that's why you can't buy it. Elokul karbanos kicha ksivu. So are all the animals, does it say kicha by them? No, it's the only reason is that the reason is because of Rabbi Pidas, like Rabbi Pidas said, that we're concerned about Revia, and that's why you can't buy it from all the animals. Gemara says, but maybe there's another problem. Maybe it's another possibility. Maybe the Rabbanan only argue with Rabbi Eliezer and say that you can purchase it Ela bepara the damel yikarim. Maybe the rabbis, maybe there's, and so maybe the rabbis only argue and say that you can purchase it by a paraduma because it's worth a lot of money. And so therefore I'll overcome it. But by all other sacrifices, maybe they'll admit to the Rebbe Eliezer that you have to be concerned. And so therefore there's no machokes. And the Rabbanan agree with our Mishnah. And so then who's the Tosefta like? Gemara says, no, it can't, we're not going to say that. Why? Bella, the Tanya, carbon money, because then who's the Tosefta like that says you could purchase it? Well, Rabbi Eliezer, well, Rabbanan. It's certainly not Rabbi Eliezer. And in that case, if you adopt this approach that the Rabbanan agree with Rabbi Eliezer, they only argue with Rabbi Eliezer by a para aduma, then they agree with him about all other animals. And who's the author of our Tosefta? We have to have somebody. And furthermore, we have an explicit brisa that says, "Ma'u sivue chavruhai." The brisa says. Now, this is a little interesting because usually a brisa. This is not part of the brisa, but Ma'u sivue chavruhai is Aramaic. The brisa is usually Hebrew, so I don't know exactly what the exact text of the brisa is, but it says there's another brisa that says explicit Ma'u sivui chavruai or Rabbi Eliezer. What did the rabbis respond to Rabbi Eliezer when Rabbi Eliezer said you can't purchase a red heifer or any animals from them as an offering? They responded, Kol tzon kedar. It says all the sheep of Kedar yikabtulach will be gathered up by you, meaning to ikabtulach, and then the pasuk continues, Yahu al ratzon mizbechi. So we see that there are in the future going to take all the animals from the idolaters as offerings. So in that case, it's a tremendous. It shows that the Rabbanan argue with Rabbi Eliezer. So you see from here that indeed they argue with that, and not just by para aduma. So the distinction of Rabbi Eliezer ben Pedas, which is that it's Rabbi Pedas, that it's a machokas tanayim between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan, seems to hold. So the Gemara now says, let's go and analyze these laws that we said about the para aduma. Again, the Rabbi Eliezer says you're not allowed to purchase a para aduma from the idolaters or any animal, and the Rabbanan say you can. So the Gemara says, where they argue about in the case where we suspect. That's what Rabbi Eliezer says you can't purchase, and the Rabbanan say you can. But in a case where for sure we know that the idolater slept with this animal, it would be disqualified to purchase the red heifer from them. So Shema Mina, so we see from here, the para kachem is be'achi. We see from here that the has the holiness of an animal that's consecrated to the altar. There's two types of consecrations to the temple. There's kache mizbeach and kache bedek habayis, an animal consecrated to be used on the altar, an animal consecrated for its value for the temple. So from the fact that the para aduma is disqualified with intercourse, that proves that it is considered kache mizbeach, even though it's not brought as a korban. It's brought on har hazeitim, it's burnt there, but it's not brought as a sacrifice, but it has the kodshim, it has the kedusha of a mizbeach, the holiness of the altar. The kodshim bedek habayis, because if it would just be something whose value is donated to the temple, would we say mi mifsalah ba ravia? What would the intercourse with it really disqualify? So we see from here that we answer this idea that it has a halacha of kache mizbeach. So the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Oh, shani para, it's not necessarily the case. The Gemara says you can't prove from here that the para duma is the kedusha of the mizbeach, because it's possible that just about this one law, the para duma is disqualified if it has a via. It's still kache bedek habayis. Why? Dechatas kariyah rachmana, because the Torah calls it a chatos, and so therefore maybe with respect to Revia, it's disqualified, even though it's considered kache bedek habayis. Why do we need to know if paraduma is kache mizbeach or kache bedek habayis? Because there's a couple of distinctions. Because if it is kache mizbeach, you can only redeem it. Well, first of all, you can only redeem it if it has a permanent blemish, not if it has, and only if it has a permanent blemish. And also, if it's kache bedek habayis, it wouldn't be disqualified with the revia. And also, if it doesn't have any blemish, you could redeem it. And Rashi adds on daf. Rashi adds on that also, if you come to redeem kache bedek habayis, you need to have a specific type of redemption, hamada va'aracha, meaning you have to stand up the animal for the kohen and he evaluates it. The kache bedek habayis, you don't need that. So these are the reasons why we want to know. So therefore, we're saying we can't prove from here that the paraduma is kache mizbeach. So if that's the case, al me'ata tipasel b'yotzi dofen. If that's the case, if it's the case that the paraduma is disqualified with revia because it's called a chatas, then if that's the case, it should also be disqualified b'yotzi dofen if it came out not through the womb, but rather through the what's called the walls of the womb, i.e., through a cesarean. And generally speaking, we say a carbon is disqualified b'yotzi dofen. And so too, if this paraduma is called a chatas, it should be disqualified. If we say, yeah, it is disqualified. Why does it say ikdisha b'yotzi dofen? That if it was that, why does it say about an animal that was born as yotzi dofen and you consecrated it to be the red heifer? According to Chachamim, according to Chachamim, it's disqualified, and according to Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon says it's not disqualified. Now, it's not logical that Rabbi Shimon would argue with this drasha that paraduma has the laws of a carbon because it's called chatas, and so therefore you should disqualify it as yotze dofen. Meaning to say, if you want to say, like the Gemara explained at first, that the paraduma is disqualified with revia because it's kache mizbeach, then we shouldn't challenge. Then it's not a difficulty from the fact that Rabbi Shimon allows a yotze dofen, because you could say that he says the para is kache bedek habayis, and he also allows a para that was nirva. But if you say, like your logic, that it's because it's a specific drasha that it's called a chatas and has the laws of the carbon, if that's the case, why would you say Rabbi Shimon argues with this drasha? If that's the case, why does he allow the yotze dofen? I mean, it's a little bit of a schwer question, because big deal. Rabbi Shimon could just argue with Rabbanan. You're going to ask a question on the Rabbanan from Rabbi Shimon. He argues. Okay, fine. So that's the next part. If you want to say Rabbi Shimon says no, even if it's a yotze dofen, it's not disqualified. It's a perfectly good animal, and it could be brought as a carbon. She says no, it can't. That you can't be brought on the altar. Ella. So therefore, what's the reason why the cow, the paraduma, will be disqualified with revia, both even according to the Rabbanan? Shani para hol mum poselba. So since a blemish disqualifies it, even though it's not a carbon, a blemish disqualifies it. Dvar erva of Avodah Zarah nami posel. So also the dvar erva, the sexual activity, and the worship of it also disqualified. Bahem mum bam, because it says in the pasuk, it says kimash chasam bahem mum bam lo yiratzu lachem. And from here we compare a hashchasa to a mum. And what's hashchasa? V'tana debei Rabbi Shmuel kol makom shenemar hashchasa eno el dvar erev avodah zarah. Says the word hashchasa means a sexual sin or idolatry. Because it says by the flood, every flesh sinned. So we see from here that it is both. So we see from here that hashlosa refers to the sexual sin, and so therefore that's the reason why the para aduma is not necessarily that. So it has nothing to do with the fact that the Rabban are always concerned about Ravia. And so haparanami whole mumposa dvar erva avodas kochavim pasiba. So for sure the para aduma will be disqualified because of this idea by a carbon kimash chasam bahem mumbam, and so the para aduma is also called a mum. So now we go back to the statement that Sheila said, Gufa Sheila my taima. He says, what's the reason why Rabbi Eliezer says you're not allowed to purchase a paraduma from a red heifer? From what's the reason why you can't purchase a paraduma from an akum? Because it says, speak to the children of Israel. You can purchase it from the Jew, but not from the idolater. If that's the case, do you want to say you can only take a truma? It says, take it for me an offering for the temple from the Bnei Yisrael. Should be the same idea. You can only take offerings from the temple from the Jews, but not from the idolaters. But if you want to say that that's the case, that you can only take an offering from a Jew and not from an idolater. Oh, now we get into the story that my father raised earlier about Dama ben Nesina. That the rabbi, one of the most famous stories in all of Shas, show me the extent of honoring one's father and one's mother. Said, go and see what a certain idolater did for his father in Ashkelon in order to praise him, in order to honor him. And Dama ben Nesina Shmo, and Dama ben Nesina is his name. First of all, there's no greater praise that the Talmud could say is, if you want to know about how to do a mitzvah, look at this idolater. But isn't this a violation of what we said earlier, that you're not allowed to talk about how that you're not allowed to say how beautiful is this idolater? And here we're praising an idolater. So the Gemara is a tremendous question. It seems to be violating its own rule. Okay, so he says that what happened? B'shishim ribo slar. They wanted to buy stones for the choshen mishpah, which is on the ephod. 60,000 was what it cost. 60,000 dinars profit. Rav Kahana masni b'shmonim ribo. It says 80,000. Mayum maftechos munachos tachas merosho sav shalav. And the keys to the treasury were underneath his father's head. V'lo tziaru. And he did not wake up his father. So how is he able to do it? How are they able to buy these stones from the idolaters? So the Gemara says, Avnei Shoam Hifsik Inyan, because it says the Be'er Bnei Yisrael Yikuli Truma Meis Kol Ish, and then it continues V'chasef Nechoshes Avnei Shoam V'avnei Miluim L'Ifod V'Lachoshen. So since it says Avnei Shoam without the vav, we see it's not connected to the verses before it, and so therefore we can't learn from here about the rest of the things for the Avnei Shoam, that the Avnei Shoam was specifically permitted to buy. Gemara says the Avnei Miluim ksiv. It says Avnei Shoam the Avnei Miluim the Hadar Arve. That after Avnei Shoam you're allowed to buy it. Then it says Avnei Miluim. So then you're not allowed to buy that anymore afterwards. So Gemara says, but still, what about the fact that they bought the Para Aduma from Dama ben Nesina as the story continues? Okay, so that's the Daf Yomi for Shabbos. We'll pick it up. I just want to say there's another version of this story where Dama ben Nesina comes out even better. That he went in and his father, this is in the Midrash, and his father was sleeping with his foot on the box. And they thought that he was just waiting for more money, so they offered him more money. And he said, no, I accepted your initial price. Like the story of Rav Safra at the Rashi says at the end of Masechus Makos, says, I accepted your initial price in my mind, so we're going to go back to the initial price. Are you allowed to wake up your father to the if you're going to lose $1 million like this? So the Pasuk says that certainly if you think your father would want you to wake him, then you can. Well, what about for a mitzvah? I mean, who wouldn't want to be woken up to do a mitzvah of, davening or going to minyan and going to the daf yomi shir, or you got to wake up your father for that? Well, what if he says, "Wake me up for that"? So then you can, but still, it's better to have somebody else do the actual waking. Okay, so we'll stop here. I want to just say, Rabbi Yosef.